Hey friends, about 3 years ago, I made a project on this channel where I printed this climbing hangboard. It's basically an exercise tool for climbing where you hang from it and get strong fingers. And well, it technically worked, although after 3 years the epoxy has definitely yellowed, and so what used to just look like a pile of kitty litter now looks like an old, dirty pile of kitty litter. Now I have had this thing hanging up for 3 years and I've used it here and there, but not really much at all because it's quite painful. I thought it was a good idea to mix epoxy and sand and cover my 3D print, but that ended up with a surface that is still generally pretty slippery, except now it's got some really sharp rocks on it. It just wasn't the most successful project. You know, 3D printing might not be the best tool for this, since this probably took at least 100 hours of printing. Well, since then I got my hands on a Stepcraft CNC, and well, I've been waiting for the opportunity to do something cool with it, and I think this is the project, because we're gonna make a wooden hangboard with a bit of a twist. So here's what I've come up with in the last few weeks. This is my new hangboard, and it's got some 3D printed parts, but it's mostly made out of wood, which was cut on my CNC machine. And like I said, this was my first time working with the CNC. This project took a lot of twists and turns. I was originally hoping to show this to you guys a few weeks ago, but I had to keep making some changes and some things happened. But here we are. I've got it now. I'm about to hang it up. But first of all, I'm going to show you everything that led up to this point. So let's get to it. Cool. As usual, my design started in Fusion 360, and this was basically my first version of this hangboard. And with this design, I was specifically going for something very compact, and I wanted to include this mechanism, which has the back part moving forward as you twist the dials on either side. And that basically reduces the amount of surface area you have for your fingers. That way, you'll slowly train yourself to hang on less and less, which is something you're gonna wanna train in order to become a really good climber. This project was definitely made for the CNC, but I did want to try comparing it to 3D printing. So I did start out making a 3D printed version of this piece. I had to split it up to fit it on the print bed, even on this giant Creality CR10S4. And then I had some issues with this ASA filament warping, and it also used a ton of material. So that just went to solidify the fact that this is not a project meant for 3D printing. Luckily, I do have this nice wood, which is actually from a disassembled table that someone was throwing out. And I'm not sure exactly what type of wood it is. It looks like it might be mahogany, but anyways, I'm just gonna go ahead and start cutting it to size and preparing it for the CNC. It's very important that this piece is completely flat, so I'll start by running it through this joiner, which will slowly shave off the bottom of this board until it's completely flat. So I'll just do a few passes, and then once I have a pretty flat surface, it's not completely there, but it's flat enough to be stable so that I can run it through the planer here. This planer is a similar tool, except for it shaves off wood from the top of the piece, and it basically creates a plank of wood that has even thickness along the entirety. After doing several passes on the planer, I'm left with these two very nice pieces of wood that are both about 16 and 2/3 millimeters wide. Now I'm going to stick it down onto some sacrificial wood so that I can hold it in place on my CNC. So for this one piece, since it's going to be cutting all the way through at the center, I decided to use some double stick tape to make sure all the pieces stay stuck down. And I won't need to tape this second piece since the CNC won't be cutting all the way through. But I will hold it down to the sacrificial board using these screws. Alright, so here we have my Stepcraft 840 CNC. It's got this nice large cutting area, and I'm just going to go ahead and place down my sacrificial board with the wood pieces attached. And then I'll just move the CNC down in the Y direction along the edge of my wood piece so that I can make sure it's perfectly aligned with the coordinate plane of the CNC. I'll load in my 1/4 inch diameter end mill, and I'll go ahead and move it to my 0 point. I set the 0 point in Fusion 360 and I have it at this top left corner. So I'll just manually move the bit there, and then I'll set that as the 0 point, and then I just have to let my process run as I programmed it in Fusion 360. I didn't show that whole Fusion 360 manufacturing workspace in this video because it's something that I'm still figuring out, so I'd rather give a more in-depth tutorial once I really know what I'm doing. But I was able to figure out enough where I'm able to make these cuts. So here you can see the machine doing its own thing. I'm just left to vacuum up the sawdust until I add a vacuum attachment to the CNC, which is definitely something I'll be doing. But for now, I'm just gonna manually vacuum it up every now and then to make sure that the cuts stay clean and that I don't spark any fires or anything like that. As you can see, this machine makes really clean cuts, and it's absolutely satisfying to watch. After doing that outer cut, the CNC will move in towards the center and start cutting out the pockets for the finger holes. And normally you would have these pockets cut before you do the outer cut, but like I said, I'm still new to this and I was still learning. So I did it all in one process, and Fusion 360 just chose to do the outline first. But that's okay because I didn't actually cut all the way through for the outline. I'll be finishing up that cut manually later, and you'll see exactly how I do that. But for now, I'll just let this pocket clearing operation continue, making all the cuts that I need for this part. Everything worked pretty flawlessly, although right at the final cut, once the bit cut all the way through, it was hitting all of that double stick tape. And actually, the way that I ran this process, I didn't need to use that double stick tape, so I definitely will use it more sparingly in the future. But anyways, the cut worked, it was pretty clean, and after I scraped off that gunky adhesive, it was a perfectly great piece. As you saw, I didn't cut all the way through the pieces on the outlines, and I'm actually gonna make that cut using the bandsaw manually. So I'm doing this kind of rough cut to get rid of all the excess wood around it, and then I can use this handheld router to really clean up the edge and make the bottom flush with the rest of my piece. And here we have one final piece, which I'm also going to clean up with the router. Now it's time to glue all these pieces together. And if you're wondering, yes, I would have glued them before putting them on the CNC, except for the fact that this CNC can't do cuts that deep. So I had to do them as 3 separate pieces and then glue them together after the fact. So I went ahead and slathered on plenty of wood glue, cleaned it up as much as I could with a damp rag, and then clamped it down into place so that it would dry and stay aligned. In the meantime, I'm going to be cutting the other wooden part, which is the piece that fits inside the finger hole and moves forward and backwards to change the amount of gripping area you have. And just to make it more visually interesting and have some contrast of different woods, I decided to cut this piece using the 1/2 inch plywood that I was using as a sacrificial board earlier. This time around, I'm doing a 2D contour cut. So this is kind of like vase mode on a 3D printer, where it just does a continuous spiral, except for instead of building up material, this is slowly lowering and cutting through the material until it's completely released. As you can see, the cut is already super clean, so I won't have to do much sanding. There is this one strange edge, and I'm not sure if that was a mistake in my design, but overall it looks super nice, and I'll be able to quickly sand that down. The next day, the glue's finished drying, and I'm able to unclamp it and test out my 2 pieces together, and it looks like they fit quite well. So now it's just time to sand everything down. Since I wasn't able to align things perfectly, I do need to do quite a bit of sanding on the inside and outside of this part to make sure that all the pieces are smooth and basically turn into one solid block. As I was working on all of this, I started to realize that the small centerpiece alone might not be enough to hold up my weight, and I do need an area to screw this onto the wall or wherever I'm going to attach it. So I decided to add an additional part that goes around all of this, as well as some metal brackets to support the bottom where I'll be hanging. Once again, I'm cutting it out of the same wood, and you might notice that the CNC doesn't seem to be cutting as cleanly, and that was kind of my bad. I ended up running the bit into the side of the CNC as I was homing it and figuring things out. So I think I bent the end mill a little bit, but anyways, the cuts came out clean enough for what I'm working on, so for now I'm just gonna let it be. But it wasn't long before I stumbled into another problem. So after the CNC finished clearing that center part, it tried to go up and around to start cutting this outline, but it jammed as it was moving up in the Z direction. And that basically led to the CNC not knowing where its actual position was, and it tried to do this super deep cut. Luckily, I was able to catch it in time and slow it down so that it still worked, and I ended up with a usable piece. So let's go ahead, cut that out, trim the edges again, and now we have to stick these parts together. Although it looks like the 0.1 millimeter clearance I put between these parts wasn't quite enough. So I thought I would just take a little bit more sanding to make this centerpiece narrow enough that it will fit into this outer piece. The little cutouts that I made for these 90-degree metal brackets also were a little bit too narrow, but that's a pretty quick and easy fix. I just used a chisel to slightly widen those indents until the brackets fit nice and snug. Once I figured that I had everything sanded down enough to make things fit together, it was time to slather in some glue. I want to make sure that this is completely coated in glue so that we have a nice strong connection. And then I'll just go ahead and press it in. And to make sure it really goes all the way down, I had to use this rubber mallet. So I'm just gonna carefully go ahead and hammer it little by little and try to push it all the way into the back of this larger back piece. It was definitely a tight fit, but little by little it was moving downward, and I had high hopes until this happened. Yeah, it looks like that fit was a little bit too tight and it ended up wedging everything apart, so I had to go back into Fusion 360 and redesign things for a third time. This time I increased the clearance between the parts that have to fit together, and I also made that backboard twice as thick and larger because I really need to make this thing as strong as possible so that it doesn't just break as soon as I hang from it. I also made sure to do a test cut first this time so I didn't end up wasting another piece of wood, and sure enough, it seemed like a good fit. Of course, not soon after starting this cut, I narrowly avoided another disaster because the bit got this close to running into one of the screws. So I decided to move the screws that were holding this piece down, and I just put them right against the edge of the wood and held them down that way so that they wouldn't interfere with the cut. It definitely looks a bit more sketchy, but it was secure enough so that I was able to complete this outer cut. With this piece, I did have the CNC cut all the way through the center part, and this time I didn't use any of that double stick tape since I realized I didn't have to, and that ended up working a lot nicer. So with that all working out, it was now time to glue all of these new parts together. So once again, I frosted these pieces in glue, sandwiched them together, and used some clamps to make sure that everything is aligned nicely. I'm also going to glue in the hangboard itself at the same time, just to turn it all into one big solid chunk of wood. As you can see, I used basically every clamp that I could find, and even then, there were still some gaps that I couldn't completely get rid of, but I'm gonna go ahead and keep moving forward. This time around, I kind of overshot the clearance between parts, so I ended up with quite a gap between the hangboard and the backboard. So I decided to employ this classic woodworking technique where you fill the gap with glue and then cover the top with sawdust from the same wood in order to just make that crack vanish. But the thing is, for whatever reason, the sawdust reacted with the glue, and once it was dry, it turned into this really unsightly gross dark brown crack. At this point, I was running out of ideas on how to hide this seam, so I thought I would try something a bit drastic and just fill in the entire crack using this thick black cyanoacrylate superglue from Starbond. I figured maybe I can create this nice clean bead of superglue in the crack and just fill it in that way. And sure, it'll be glaring, but maybe I can make it look good. But even with my steady hand, it wasn't coming out that clean. So I said, screw it, I'm covering this whole thing with superglue. Yeah, I kind of freaked out and just ended up coating the entire top with this black superglue. I don't know, I was getting desperate. But once it was all dried up, it turned into a more matte finish. And after lots and lots of sanding, getting it down to 240 grit, I actually ended up with this pretty interesting varnish on this top surface. It's definitely not what I was going for at the beginning, but I'm gonna have to be happy with it for now because otherwise I'd be working on this forever. So we're moving forward. I drilled the pilot holes for my brackets, screwed those into place using these nice white screw heads, and now it's time for our 3D printed hardware. So here are all the parts for this little system I created, and the way it works is I'm gonna take this nut and drop it into this little sleeve right here, just like that. I'll push it into place using my bolt, and that's gonna give us this nice strong metal thread in this plastic part. I'll do that again for the other half, and then I'll push the bolt through this knob here. That bolt gets covered up with this faceplate, which also has this little indicator so we'll know how much we're turning the knobs. And then that snaps into this sleeve right here, which is kind of a bearing that will hold this all into place on our hangboard. Once I've got those printed parts prepared, this little wooden insert just fits right in there. And it's just a loose fit, but that's all that I need because once I press everything down into the hangboard like this, it's all held into place just using friction. So the idea here is basically going to be that I can turn each of these knobs a quarter turn every day and slowly have less and less room for my fingers to hang on. And it ended up working very nicely, where it takes about 100 quarter turns for that back piece to go all the way from the maximum depth to the minimum depth. So that's great. Finally, everything's working as I intended. And now all I have to do is drill some more pilot holes and screw this onto my wall so that I can hang from it. My first plan was to hang this above my bedroom door, and I did use these nice long 3-inch screws. My stud finder did show studs, but it turned out that it was a false detection, and I was actually just screwing into my air conditioning vent on the other side of the wall. So there's no way that I'm hanging from that. So I'm gonna have to go ahead and move this to the same location where my old hangboard was, on this solid wood column, and that's gonna make sure that this thing is completely stuck against the wall. There we go. Now it's in place, the dials are working, and yes, it does in fact hold my entire weight. So there we go. It's a very unique and interesting looking hangboard. There's nothing else quite like it, and I'm excited to start training on it. All right, friends, finally, I have a great functioning hangboard, and my little twisting mechanism works great, so I'm really excited about that. The final appearance did change from what I was initially expecting. There were a lot of twists and turns in this project, but they were all great learning experiences, and it just goes to show you can't fail if you don't give up. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed learning alongside myself, or maybe just screaming at the screen if you already knew all the mistakes I was making. But I'm really happy with how it turned out, and I'm really excited to keep using the CNC. As you saw, the CNC can produce large parts a lot quicker than a 3D printer could. It's probably around 10 times faster or more. But on the other hand, I would also say it takes 10 times more labor after the fact. You know, there's a lot of hand work and actual involvement. So both 3D printing and the CNC have their own place in a maker studio. I'm really fortunate to have both of those tools, and I really look forward to doing more projects with both the CNC and of course 3D printers, and maybe even using them together. So look forward to that in the future. But that's it for today. So until next time, I'm Devin, this is Make Anything, and as always, stay inspired.